Hello, and welcome to week 38. I thought we would take some time today and just sit in my office. It seemed like the right place for this kind of scholarly and academic information. So I hope you'll grab your favorite beverage, whatever it might be, and sit down and relax, and let's see what we can learn this week. Last week, we started this incredible climb up the mountain of genealogies, and I do realize that the air on the descent can start to get a bit thin. But just know that the information in these genealogies are there for a reason. Don't expect to be able to glean it all out at once. I know as I look at these genealogies, I know just a fraction of what they are really there for, but each time I have a revelation in the genealogies, it seems like it is an aha moment. So just know that there's a reason for them to be there. And also, as we're going through these genealogies, that there's a logical pattern to the order that's given. And remember also that these genealogies are given as foundations for things to come. And so much of what we will see, some of it we will maybe never have any real revelation on. But other parts of it, we may see the reason for them later on in our journey. Last week, we saw that the genealogies began with Adam and went to Abraham. And so we see that God begins by showing us he created a people, and then taking us from Adam to Abraham, showing us that he created a people for himself. And so after the descendants of Abraham, we see the descendants of Esau. So why that? His name is referred to as Edom. We know that Edom is another name for Esau. We have to remember that Esau, was a son of Abraham. And once again, we see that there are two sons. We will see the lineage of Esau, and we will see the lineage of Israel, whose name is also Jacob. And remember that these things are given to us as models of a much bigger picture. And as we continue on through the word, we're going to see that there are people that God has created. And then even today, there are people that God has created for himself. And so this week we move on from the descendants of Esau, of Edom. And now we start going into the sons of Israel. We know that Israel is another name for Jacob. And we find that it tells us that Judah prevailed over all his brothers. So Judah became the leader of all the tribes. And that's obviously why there is so much more given on the tribe of Judah. And because we know that Judah becomes the kingly tribe. And we also know that David comes through that tribe, and Jesus in our new covenant, Jesus comes through that tribe. And so it gives us the descendants of Judah, and it begins to break them down by their clans. The first tribe that comes after the tribe of Judah is the tribe of Reuben. And we find that Reuben, it clearly tells us, was Jacob's firstborn. He was Israel's firstborn. But because of his sin and his failure, we know that the right of the firstborn went to Joseph. And it tells us that very clearly, that Joseph got the double portion. He got the birthright of the firstborn. And then we find that there is a term that is often used, and sometimes it can be very confusing. And that term that's used is the term the father of. There are times that that term is telling us literally that so-and-so is the father of so-and-so. Other times that's not what it's telling us. What it's telling us is that so-and-so is the founder of a place. For example, in 1 Chronicles 2:51, we're told that Salma is the father of Bethlehem. But then when you go to 1 Chronicles 4:4, it says there were the sons of Hur, the firstborn of Ephrath, the father of Bethlehem. So was Salma the father of Bethlehem, or was Ephrath the father of Bethlehem? And the answer is yes, because both of these, Salma and Ephrath, are the founders of Bethlehem. And so sometimes when you come to that term, we have to look and say, is it talking to me and telling me about a founder of a city, or is it telling me about a man who has a son? As we go through these genealogies that are recorded, what we will find is that the recording of the names go from the time of the beginning of the tribal beginnings to the time when the tribes are carried off into captivity. We find that Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh, it tells us they were taken away by Pul, king of Assyria, and that they were taken away by the ruthless commander Tilgath-Pilneser. We find that as we look at these things later on, we'll see that Judah was not carried away to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar for another 150 years. So often we get our timelines a bit confused because we don't see all the years in between. And so again, we see that Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh, which were on the east side of the Jordan, who didn't cross over the Jordan, you remember the stories, didn't cross over the Jordan with the rest of the tribes, went over and helped them fight their battles, and then went back and settled Transjordan, as it's called. And so we find that there's 150 years between the time Tilgath-Pilneser comes and carries away the Transjordan people into Assyria. And then we go through those years. We will see this later on, that there's different invasions. And as a result of those different invasions, they're carried away, more are carried away with each invasion. But we'll look at that at a later time. After we go through the genealogies of all the different tribes, then we come to the descendants of the priests and the Levites. And once again, we find that there's a very important piece of information that puts some pieces together for us, and it bridges the gap from Samuel to David. And we know that Samuel was a big part of David's life. And we know that Samuel has a son, Joel, and it's mentioned in these genealogies, and that Joel has a son named Heman. We also will be reading as we go on, and we'll see the important part Heman takes in the worship that David sets and establishes at the tabernacle. And also in the time of Solomon, we're going to once again see how important the ministry of Heman was. And if you remember, we've talked about it, but I'll just speak about it by way of reminder, that Samuel, as wonderful of a man and a prophet as he was, his son Joel didn't follow in the integrity of his father. And you wonder, how could someone like Samuel end up with a son like Joel who doesn't follow in his father's footsteps? And I'm sure many are asking the same question today. We see godly men and whose sons will not walk in their same steps. Even today, it doesn't take more than sometimes one generation. How grateful we are when we see our children walking in the things that they have learned and in their own relationship with God. But the beautiful part is to see that Heman was truly affected by his grandfather's life. We will see the time when David brings the ark into Jerusalem, but the tabernacle remained in Gibeon. And we will see that Heman was the main minister of the tabernacle that remained in Gibeon. I'll remind you of that again when we come to it, because that's precious information. You know, all you grandparents out there, if you feel like somehow you failed, just know that God gives grandchildren are God's second chance to us. And I thank God for my children and their walk with God. And I pray that I will have an influence on my grandchildren and my great grandchildren. And so I pray that that's your heart too. And may Samuel be that example to us and that inspiration to us as grandparents and great-grandparents. I do realize that this is a very difficult time in our travels and in our trek through the Bible, and it can be very difficult reading all these names. So I thought maybe I would give you a couple of things to look for on the way. I know when we are climbing up a steep mountain or a hill, that so often we are looking at the ground to just look at the next step. And so there's been times I've had to remind myself, why don't you turn around and look at the scene behind you and see how far up you've come. And so I thought maybe I could give you some stopping points along the way, things to look for, so that as you're climbing, you say, oh, there's a bigger picture here. And so let me just give you 4 things that you can look for as you're walking up this climb. For example, which tribe has the shortest list of descendants? I know as I was reading through this again, and I came to that tribe, it was like, and that's all you got. We know they have many more descendants, but when you get there, you go, things that make you go, And another question, there are 2 descendants of Ephraim that are mentioned, Ezer and Eliad. And we're told that they are killed by men from a certain city. What city were they from? Who were the people, who were the men from what city that killed Ezer and Eliad, descendants of Ephraim? Another thing you might want to look for is, who did Jerusalem originally belong to? That's an interesting study which maybe later on we'll look at a little closer. But see if you can find, who did Jerusalem originally belong to? Another one that I found rather interesting is, who is the man whose greatest claim to infamy is that he divorced his wives? Isn't that a sad thing to be known for? And what was the great thing that you're known for in your life? Well, I'm known as the man who divorced my wives. So watch for those things. Just something of interest for you to look for. Also, look for familiar names that are carried down through family lines. What you'll find is, just because the name is the same as a name that you already know doesn't mean that that's the same person. We found that with Joshua. Remember Joshua, the son of Nun, and Joshua, the son of Hezron. And we saw that although it's the same name, 2 different genealogies. And so look for names that are passed down, especially through tribes. Also, skimming is acceptable. There are names that are never repeated. And so you might want to skim through the names, watching for names that are familiar, watching for names that may be important later on. You'll see names like Ahitub, Joel, Eleazar, and even Nathan. These are names that are names of people that are important and well known, and yet we'll find that their names are mentioned about people who are not so well known. And so we need to be careful that we don't confuse them. I've heard teachings and they've brought you back to the name of someone, and just because it was the same name, it's like, but that's not the same person. And they've taught it as though it is the same person. And so just look for names that are familiar, but know that they're not always the same person. As I meditated on that, I thought, isn't it interesting that throughout Scripture, there might be names of important people that are mentioned again a second time, but throughout all of the Bible, there's only one David. I don't think that's coincidence. And when you look at the name David, The name David means the beloved one. And as I think about that, I know David is a type and shadow of Christ himself, and that Jesus was going to come through the line of David, and he is of the seed of David. And as I thought about that, I thought the words that the Father spoke when Jesus came to the waters to be baptized, and John baptizes him as Jesus is coming out of the water. We hear these words when the Father says, "This is my beloved Son. In him I'm so pleased." But those words, "This is my beloved Son." I hear God saying, I want you to know, this is my David. This is the one that I have promised that would come through that line. And now, again, I know this week is a difficult week, but I pray that this week leaves you with a sense of satisfaction, even if it's just, I did it, I got through it. But I pray that God's light will shine on the pages, and as you trod through the word, that you will come away richer for your perseverance. I guarantee you, next week will get easier, so don't give up. And I'll see you again next week.